Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Denise Malzeral, a professor joint between the School of Public and International Affairs in the Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment and the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I'm delighted today to be able to welcome Dr. Narasimha Rao, who's an associate professor of energy systems at the Yale School of Environment. He also serves as a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Dr. Rao's research examines energy systems, climate change, and well-being. He's particularly interested in equity in energy transitions and the impact of climate change and its mitigation on poverty around the world. He's a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report. He was a recipient of the European Research Council starting grant for a project entitled Decent Living Energy, which examines the energy and climate impacts of poverty eradication in emerging economies. He received his PhD from Stanford University in Environment and Resources and a master's degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Technology Policy and Electrical Engineering. He'll speak today on the role of extreme heat, urbanization, and household income on air conditioning possession around the world. As he speaks, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At the end of his talk, we'll have time for discussion, and I will be calling on people who've posted in the Q&A. Professor Rao, we look forward to your talk, and to the audience, we look forward to your questions. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me at the seminar today. So the topic of my talk is the role of many different factors that affect AC possession around the world. And I actually took the opportunity today to think about sharing new research in the spirit of an academic seminar. This is a topic around which there's been a flurry of activity in the last few years, not only in academia, but in policy. So I'm working along with many different other groups on this topic. And I'd like to share some new work that hasn't been published yet. It's far enough along that I'd appreciate and I'm excited to share some of the research, but also I welcome any feedback and comments, as it is still very much a work in progress. But having said that, I think a lot of you may be new to me, may not know my work. I'd like to start off by sharing some of my broad research objectives and research agenda and some recent findings, which also provide a context for this talk. And then I'll delve into this topic in more detail. So my general area of interest, energy, climate, and well-being, is motivated by the general idea that we have growing evidence that GDP, or economic growth, which is the main driver of energy demand in most of our analysis and research, is important, but still largely disconnected from human well-being and human development. And we have growing evidence that when we look at energy demand from this broader lens, we are seeing countries' progress in human development in different indicators have a different relationship with energy growth than the relationship we see between GDP growth and energy demand, which is very linear. So in the hope of understanding ways to provide improved development outcomes and using less energy and having less of an impact on the planet, I think we need more ways to understand the relationship between energy and well-being. So in the last few years, I've been developing an analytical framework to try to relate energy demand in society to different well-being indicators. So in these first couple of articles that have been published in the last year, in this project, Decent Living Energy, what my team has been doing is to develop an analytical framework to link direct energy services as well as indirect energy demand to multidimensional poverty, understanding what it will take to eradicate poverty. And this builds on tools of energy modeling, but also industrial ecology, and of course, social policy to understand what are the fundamental material underpinnings of poverty in the first place. And in order to provide those resources to people around the world, how much energy do we need, and what will be the impact of that on emissions? And the general finding are both in the broad sense, the impact on climate mitigation of growing to eradicate poverty, but also specific insights on where there are synergies between improving human development outcomes and reducing emissions. So for instance, we find that public transportation in emerging cities in developing countries, housing that's efficient and based on local construction practices, diversified diets, these are all areas where we can reduce emissions growth, but also improve development outcomes for those who are at lowest income groups by and large. And overall, the message of this research has also been that the more we focus on shared resources, we tend to have a better impact in terms of energy resource use. In the future, as indicated by this perspective on advancing energy and well-being, I want to focus more on looking at linking individual well-being outcomes, looking more at distributional outcomes within countries to energy demand and resource use. And from that, we may be able to get a more formal way to bring in sustainable consumption as a dimension of mitigation options and understand what actual impacts on well-being we're seeing from people's consumption, both self-perceived well-being as well as objective indicators of well-being. There's a growing literature on well-being science and empirical literature assessing people's well-being, but that is largely disconnected from our energy research. And so the extent to which we can find analytical tools to build bridges between energy research, well-being science, and also the sociology of energy, we can more broadly assess our lifestyles and consumption patterns and how they affect the environment. And finally, that gives us the option to also look at distributional effects of some of the negative impacts of energy use. So for instance, recently we found in India, if you look at the air pollution impacts of energy use, aside from the well-known problem of indoor air pollution causing a significant number of premature deaths to women and children, if you look at ambient air pollution across the country, the contribution of our indirect consumption from transport, electricity, as well as just general manufacturing has a disproportionate impact on the poor who are not consuming very much. So these distributive impacts on well-being are also important to consider when we look at the energy transition more broadly. So one of the underpinnings of this work also is this idea of multidimensional poverty. I wanted to just spend a minute on that. So we've developed a dashboard, if you will, of indicators that are the material underpinnings of well-being. So these are not sufficient for human flourishing, but they're necessary material resources people need, which basically divide into physical well-being and also social well-being. And so we have developed this dashboard of indicators and have now, for one particular year, a pretty comprehensive understanding across the world of people's deprivations along these different dimensions. So for example, cooling is one of them I'm going to focus on today. And we know the number of people that have access to air conditioning in different parts of the world. But what I'm going to talk about in this talk today is a little bit about how do we understand where we have the need for cooling, and where do we see, just from market forces, where air conditioning is proliferating, and where are there gaps where we actually need to have some kind of cooling solutions where people may not have access to any. But there's also other forms of deprivations that we need to track, and we can look at the relative impact of these different services on energy and emissions, so that we can understand what the impact of poverty eradication in terms of removing all of these obstacles will have on climate. So that has been the focus of my research in the last several years. So looking at cooling, there's been a flurry of activity, as I mentioned. If we look at the Lancet Countdown report, they're talking about heat stress as one of the major health risks facing the planet in the coming years. In 2019, for example, there were something like 475 million additional exposure events. That's person days of exposure to heat stress. And this is also causing a lot of premature deaths. So in 2000 to 2018, a couple of decades, we've had heat-related mortality in people older than 65 increased by 50% or more, reaching about 300,000 deaths. And what's interesting about this is that the majority of these have occurred in a few countries, in Japan, China, India, and in Central Europe. So the distribution of these extreme events and extreme heat is extremely important. There's also a significant loss of livelihood and labor productivity from heat stress. And a lot of people now are increasingly looking at those climate impacts. What I'm focusing on in my research is on household energy poverty with respect to cooling. So the Sustainable Development Goals focus a lot on having energy access at all to clean fuels for cooking and to electricity. But there's a growing interest among academics and some policymakers to broaden some of the services that we include in SDG 7. That is, we need not just electricity connections, but we need the services in order to provide well-being to people. And one of them is to avoid heat stress. There's also a concern with the refrigerants from air conditioning. The Kigali Agreement is intended to try and phase out refrigerants that are warmers, short-term forces. Some of the refrigerants that are being used today, like R22, have a warming potential of almost a factor of 2,000 compared to carbon dioxide. And there is, of course, the concern about the energy use associated with air conditioning, which has been growing significantly. And it represents some sort of a positive feedback almost. We build ACs to respond to heat stress, and the energy use from it additionally causes more climate change. So there's been a lot of interest, both in terms of AC as an adaptive solution and making it more available to people, but then also on the energy side, from thinking about how can we find efficient solutions, passive solutions, where we do have the adaptive capacity, but we don't have to really rely on the traditional energy-intensive technology. So it's in that broad context of this policy and analysis that I wanted to make my remarks. So there are two questions that I want to address in this talk today. One of them is, how many people are likely to be exposed to heat stress, and where are they? So this is a question that requires us to understand where are we going to have extreme heat, but we need to overlay that on top of population distribution. Where are we going to see population centers grow in the future, besides where they are today? So in some sense, we're trying to identify hotspots in terms of the co-location of people and extreme heat. And then we need to understand on top of that, who's likely to own an air conditioner. And even then, we are still only considering exposure by addressing heat stress, where people are and whether they have ACs. But when we consider actual heat-related mortality, we have to consider the vulnerability of people. And so that's analysis that we're doing that I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to focus on these two questions. And the first question is research that is already completed. And the second question is the one I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking on with respect to new research. The first question is, what do we define as heat stress? There are, of course, many different indicators one can use. We've been fairly conservative or risk averse in thinking about it. The first thing is we start with temperature data that we get from global climate change models, GCMs. And these are downscaled from a number of different sources to average daily temperature at a very fine spatial resolution, about 50-kilometer resolution. But we're generally going to look at countries as a unit of analysis. And so these are population weighted up to an annual national average daily temperature. And then the question is, what temperature threshold do we define heat stress? So the context of my research, as I mentioned, is to provide people with just the most basic services. And so what is required to avoid harm? And we've used one interpretation, which is if we consider 5 non-consecutive days of average daily temperatures above a threshold, we would consider that to be an exposure to heat stress for people. And we've chosen a fairly conservative threshold of 26 degrees Celsius, but we vary this up and down just to look at the sensitivity. Should also keep in mind that I'll be talking about a reference temperature, usually of about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius, which is the reference that's used by and large in energy research today. So using this threshold and sensitivity to it, we've calculated the number of people that have exposure to this heat stress, and also based on patterns of income growth and conventional ways to project AC ownership, who's likely to be exposed to heat stress. So I'd like to share some of those results with you first. So based on past work, we found that roughly 3 billion people today are exposed to heat stress as we've defined it. And if we look at the density of population, not the share of people in countries, just in terms of density per square kilometer, we see that they're concentrated largely in India, China, parts of Southeast Asia, and a few countries in Western Africa. And so if you're interested in the number of people that are going to be exposed to heat stress, you really have to focus on these regions. At the same time, if we think about the dependence of this number of people who are exposed to this temperature threshold, it's interesting to see that the population who are exposed to heat stress doesn't vary so significantly as we move to lower thresholds. That if we consider that people ought to be protected from even temperatures between 20 and 26 degrees Celsius, for example, the percentage of population or the absolute number of people that would be exposed or would need to be protected doesn't increase proportionately. And this is mainly because the places where you have people exposed to higher than 26 degrees average daily temperatures are the same places where people are exposed to more than 20. However, if we think about the energy that would be needed to avoid that heat stress, that of course scales proportionately. So I'm not going to talk about energy gaps, but I just wanted to point out this distinction that the population that's exposed to heat stress by our definition is not so sensitive to the temperature threshold as much as is the energy. Now, the prevalence of air conditioners is of tremendous concern. We already have something like 1.6 billion air conditioners in use all over the world. And this already constitutes 15 to 20% of global electricity use. The future growth in the global south is also expected to be significant. But today, I believe we expect another 1.5 billion air conditioners by 2050, according to the IEA projections. And of those, half of those air conditioners are expected to be purchased in 3 countries. That's India, China, and Indonesia, I believe. So in those same countries that we expect to see very large number of people exposed to heat stress, we also expect to see a large number of air conditioners. So this points to a really important issue of inequity, that we expect that the distribution of income, among other things, is going to be extremely important in the future in order to find out if this the growth of air conditioning use is actually addressing the heat stress problem. Never mind the fact that the conventional technologies that are being sold and diffused in the marketplace are not the most efficient and are not going to be used in the most efficient way. This is some topic I'll get to at the end of this talk. So the energy use associated with this, as I've mentioned, we have calculated based on very minimal assumptions of energy use. And I only mention that because people who look at these numbers of energy use may notice that the energy estimates that we've shown here on the order of 1,000 to 2,000 terawatt hours are almost 5 to 10 times less than the energy projections by the IEA for cooling as a whole. And that's something that I'm going to get to later, which is the range of estimates that we see for energy use are really significant. And so the behavioral aspect of air conditioning is also extremely important. But I'm going to focus my talk more on the ownership of air conditioners and only at the end address a little bit on energy use as well. So if we look at heat exposure and we project it out into the future, the number of people that may be exposed to our definition of heat stress may actually increase or may decrease, depending upon climate change, but also depending upon the acquisition of air conditioners. So on the left side over here, you're seeing at the bottom the number of people we expect will acquire air conditioners based on existing models of AC adoption, based on different projections of income growth. And on top, you're seeing, based on different climate futures, the population that would need air conditioning, given the growth of population and its distribution, as well as temperature projections in the future. And we've analyzed this for different socioeconomic futures. These are possibly familiar to you, the shared socioeconomic pathways that define projections of population, income, urbanization, and also income inequality. And so this gap of the cooling gap, as we call it, could be anywhere from 1 to 4.7 billion people, depending upon what future we're going to live in. And so the question does arise, if you look at the gap here, first of all, what future do we expect, but also, are we realistic about projecting air conditioning? And that's the topic I want to focus on now, is how do we project who's likely to own an AC in the future? What are the different ways people are looking at that question? And what am I bringing that's different about this question? So there are a couple of models of AC ownership that are currently prevalent. The one I'm showing right now, this is what's used in integrated assessment on a global scale, at a country scale, to understand the interaction of climate and income. And typically in a lot of models, the climate measured as this average cumulative degree days above 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. There's more of kind of a saturation level, that in colder places, you'd have a lower level of saturation in the population, and in hotter places, you'd have more ACs overall. But then the real only driver of air conditioning in countries would then be income. So if you look at countries in Northern Europe, which have CDDs of in the tens or hundreds at most, you would expect to have AC penetration levels of not more than 10 to 20%. Whereas in tropical countries or subtropical countries where you have CDDs of 1,500 to 2,000 or more, you really don't have any constraint. You expect that with time, as people grow income, everyone would have an air conditioner. So that's what these models would say. But to some extent, this belies reality. So if you look at the United States as a clear anomaly, we have over 85% of people who have air conditioners, and CDDs are 300 odd with this measure. If you look at Germany or Switzerland, the number of CDDs by this definition are in the tens. So Switzerland is 22 and Germany is 50, but you have 28 to 45% of the population owning air conditioners. So there's something about wealthy countries where perhaps it's not this measure of climate, but some other measure of climate that influences whether people want ACs or not. And in the other extreme, if you look at higher countries with higher CDDs, so tropical and subtropical countries, it would seem that the only thing that matters is income. And we do find in different countries, as I'll show you later, different levels of AC ownership among emerging economies with similar income levels. So there seems to be something missing even there. It's too simplistic to just look at national average income. More recently, there's been a very interesting study that came out literally while I was doing my research a few months ago, that took about 11 countries' microdata and pooled them together to look at the relationship between household income cross-sectionally and AC ownership for different levels of climate. And essentially, they modeled diffusion curves for AC at different levels of income, where the steepness of that increase in AC with income was determined by climate. So climate is kind of a condition that determined how fast AC ownership would increase. And generally, they found that in countries, it's the richer people who tend to have more ACs, both in rich countries and poor countries. And so that's kind of an obvious finding, but it's a nice quantification that we have of within country inequality, and what how many people have ACs depends also on the income inequality, not just average income growth in these countries. So this is good progress in our understanding, but there's still some factors that are missing. So for example, this is just 11 countries and it's just a cross section. So we don't really look over time at how air conditioning has evolved. We're also using this reference temperature of 20 degrees Celsius and average cumulative degree days based on average daily temperatures, which I'm thinking that may not be necessarily the only climate consideration. And so it's with the motivation to think about other factors that may be influencing AC ownership that I undertook this research. So I have two studies that I want to talk about. One of them is a global panel analysis based on a new data set that from where I've got some insights about what might be additionally driving AC adoption. And then I have a zoom into a few countries where I actually have looked at microdata. And the reason is that at the global level, I have looked at a single climate indicator at a national level, which for big countries may be a bit of a simplification since you have many countries with many climate zones. In any case, let me start with the panel analysis. I had access to a very unique data set. This is by Euromonitor International, which has tracked from their own surveys AC ownership in countries since 1977. So there are about 58 countries, 21 of which are within the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. That covers about 5.5 billion people out of 7.5 billion in 2015. And so this gives a nice time series of data at a national level of the number of ACs that are owned. And this covers central air conditioning, wall units, and split air conditioners. So it's pretty current in terms of the technologies. And so I wanted to ask the question, can we examine different drivers at a national level to explain the evolution of AC ownership as per these data? The nice thing is it's also quite representative of different parts of the world. So you'll notice that there are a few countries in every continent by and large. In Europe, you'll notice there's a lot of gaps, but we still do have some of the warmer countries represented. Croatia, Austria, Italy, Portugal, for example. So this has good coverage as well. And so I found this to be an interesting set of data. So here's descriptively some information about them. So this is time trends of the population share that owns air conditioning. And there's some interesting factors here. Of course, you can clearly see that average income is a major factor if you look at sub-Saharan Africa compared to the Middle East or East Asia or even North America. But you'll notice some interesting differences as well. So you'll see a big gap here in Middle East and North Africa between richer countries and poorer countries in terms of the level of AC ownership. You see there's a big spread in East Asia. And North America, of course, the US and Canada have very high levels of ownership today. It's also interesting in Europe that you've had actually only in recent decades a surge in AC ownership since 1990 for the most part. And it's also interesting to notice that the shape of this is not so straightforward. And you have some sinusoidal trends, and I think part of this is because population growth in some cases has outpaced AC ownership growth, so that you have flattening out in certain countries. So I point this out partly also to emphasize that this is not very well behaved in terms of trying to model a diffusion curve if using just ownership rates. And so I considered, what if we look at the absolute number of ACs more broadly, based on total amount of income growth in countries. In some ways, this total size of the market also may have an influence in terms of the knowledge about ACs or the market maturity. And so in some sense, you lose that if you look at ownership rates. So we considered looking at overall AC penetration in terms of absolute numbers. And if you relate that in terms of the ownership of ACs to the GDP on a log scale, you start to see a little bit more of a maybe consistent pattern, perhaps, for countries where perhaps you might hypothesize that you have similar global trends in terms of growth of GDP and the growth in the AC ownership. But you also see at any particular income level, vast differences in AC ownership levels. So obviously there are other contextual factors that are also driving AC ownership that we want to consider. So I had a hypothesis with this data, and the hypothesis is that perhaps there are certain time-varying factors we want to consider, such as income, but there are also contextual time-invariant factors, and the most important one I want to look at is climate. For the most part in this time frame, 30 to 40-year time frame, most research communities use an average temperature when they're considering studies looking at climate impacts. So that's a sort of time invariant factor, but there are also other institutional factors that may also together explain AC possession levels. And so the question is, what kind of analysis would one need to do to be able to incorporate both time varying and time invariant factors? So let me talk about some of the drivers I want to model. One of them that's new is urbanization. And with income, not to look at just GDP, but household income in particular. I wanted to explore income inequality, but didn't get very far with that in terms of results. So I won't talk too much about that. And then at the country level, I wanted to explore different types of climate variables, which may manifestations of temperature that are not just average temperatures over the year. And I'll talk about that in a second. So when we think about why people have ACs, if you especially think about in the US or in developed countries, is it those few days in summer that are unbearable that drive you to get an AC? Or is it the cumulative degree days that matter? So one thing to think about is maybe consider an indicator that looks at the number of days that you're above a threshold. But then you also might think about, is it really the average temperature and the day that matters, or is it the maximum temperature? Is it really those really bad days where you have temperatures above what you consider tolerable? So we may consider cumulative degree days, but we may consider them in the context of a maximum temperature of the day rather than the average. And similarly, we may think about nighttime temperatures, so the minimum temperature. We also don't consider humidity. So this is something that only recently is being taken into account in climate models and climate impact models, but really more in the context of adaptation and climate impacts, and less so in the context of AC adoption. So what about humidity? We all know that that's something that cannot be fixed with a fan or with ventilation. You have to have air conditioning. So we considered an ensemble of climate indicators using a different range of threshold temperatures, looking at both dry bulb and wet bulb, looking at average, maximum, and minimum temperatures, and looking at cumulative degree days, as well as the number of days above a threshold. And so I've used this nomenclature that I'm going to point to, TAS being the average temperature, the W being the wet bulb temperature, the max and min referring to the max and min daily temperature, and then DOT referring to the days above a threshold. And I mostly will focus on the TAS variables and the TAS max variables rather than the DOT, which turned out to not be so significant. So the other question that comes up is, if these variables are correlated statistically, we can't do much analysis with them. So it's important to understand that they are correlated, but they do differ in different parts of the world. So here I'm giving you an example of climate zones in the US that are humid, that's the top row, southeast regions of the US, and the B zones in the US are not humid. And you see quite a difference in terms of the difference between the wet bulb temperatures and the dry bulb temperatures. If you also compare the correlation of this conventional metric, the CDD at 20 degrees, to all other climate variables, you'll see that there is a pretty strong correlation, as indicated by the more red. But as you go to certain temperatures closer to 30 degrees, both in terms of CDD and DOT, you do see a departure. So really, it's the temperature, the TAS and the TAS max variables that are between 26 and 30 degrees, where we do start to see differences from the base, the conventional metric. So the economic approach I've used is a multi-level model. The reason for doing this is that it allows you to consider both contextual factors, because if you think about a panel analysis where you have fixed effects for countries, you absorb all of the contextual factors. You can't examine any specific covariates at the country level. And so a multi-level model allows you to model both time-varying country-level characteristics, but also particular covariates at the country level, in my case, climate change. And so my model is assuming you have a single set of coefficients to represent time-varying factors across the world, but you have a different intercept to represent different starting points, or just the level of ACs may differ in countries based on the climate. And because you're dealing with time series, we need certain error correction that I also perform to make sure that we have statistically valid results. I do a similar model that's just a pooled cross-section time series where I don't have these country level intercepts as a sensitivity, with also that error correction. And so I want to show you some of these results, but just to show you quickly, this is the formulation of the model, where we have urbanization, income as the main time-varying variables, and then the ensemble of climate variables I switch out in different models in order to see which one gives me a better goodness of fit. And based on that, I want to examine which one is likely to be more accurate representation of AC penetration in the future. And I looked at the interaction of climate and income as well. So the main result I want to point you to, I don't need you to study this table, but I just want to point out that some of the main findings is that we found that urban population growth has a very strong impact, even larger than that of income. It's a disproportionately high impact. So for a 100% change in urban population, you see 170% change in the number of people owning air conditioning. And this has a lot to do, I think, with potentially the urban heat island effect, but also markets, peer effects, other aspects, urban form as well that may influence temperature conditions in urban areas. And among climate variables, we found that the average daily temperature, but using a much higher threshold, has the highest fit. Another interesting finding, which may be slightly inconsistent with previous findings, is that I didn't find a very significant interaction, impact between income and climate. That is, you do see a small reduction at higher level income levels of the impact of climate, and conversely, but it's a very negligible effect in practice. So in effect, what I'm seeing is that income and climate independently affect AC ownership. I also find that once you take into account the climate effect of context, that it really takes away most of the variance between countries. And that was an interesting finding, that climate really seems to capture a lot of the contextual difference that's not captured by the time varying factors. So the one question that comes up is, how much of an effect is this temperature variable on the AC ownership? And so I looked at the marginal effect of this climate variable, just looking at that coefficient and looking at the difference between any country's CDDs and the mean for the entire data set. And this is showing you that marginal effect in terms of the percentage effect on AC ownership in different countries. And that blue line is how I've sorted the countries. That's the effect of the conventional metric. And this orange line below it is the one that is showing the best fit among my different climate variables. So what this is saying is, for the most part, other than a few countries, it seems to be that we may be overestimating the effect of climate on AC ownership when we use this conventional metric. And that when we use a different temperature threshold, or even a max temperature as the basis for determining your climate variable, we may find a slightly lower AC ownership level. But that's not by a very significant margin, but it still is something. The other thing I found is I actually ran this model for a subset of countries that were between the tropics and outside the tropics. And I actually found that when I do those subsets of models, I find that the wet bulb temperatures start to become significant. They're not the best model fit, but they start to become significant. Which is to say that as we go down to a finer spatial scale, it may become actually more important to start looking at these alternative climate variables in analyzing future AC ownership. So from the panel study, I just wanted to highlight some of the key conclusions, is that urbanization, which has not typically been modeled before in prediction models, ought to be modeled, and we actually have it in the SSPs. Household income is important, but it's useful to look at income not just as GDP, but as the household share of income, and that climate indicators matter, although it's just a few percentage points of an impact. By 2050, that does add up to hundreds of millions of people. So when we look far into the future, we may want to put more research into understanding people's sensitivity to different manifestations of climate. And finally, I am finding that the average temperature at 26 Celsius to be a more realistic threshold that triggers AC possession. So now, given the fact that this national indicator is a bit of a simplification for climate variables in large countries, we did a bit of a deep dive into 3 countries, Brazil, Mexico, and the US. And this is using microdata. So this is actual survey data. We can now study when does a household X own an air conditioner or not. So this is more of a kind of a logit or probit analysis of what's the probability that a household owns an AC given the number of explanatory variables. So you start to see just from these diagrams itself, these graphs, that climate's important. So the lighter colors indicate higher penetration levels, and you see that in humid areas in the south and southeast, you have higher levels of penetration in the US, but in in Oregon and in the northern states, northwestern states, you have less penetration. So I did a more conventional model, probit model, where we assess whether the probability of a household owning an AC, and we just use the same ensemble of climate variables where we swap them in, but we add a new explanatory variable, which is house ownership, in addition to income and urbanization. Does owning a home influence whether or not you have an AC? I just want to provide an illustration for Brazil and Mexico. You're looking at the state level average AC penetration. On the y-axis, you're looking at the total number of conventional cooling degree days. And on the x-axis, you're looking at income, per capita income, average income for these different states. And so you'll see a certain pattern that as you move to the right, higher income states with higher average incomes do have bigger bubbles, the bigger bubbles being the higher levels of AC penetration. However, if you look at any particular income level, there's quite a variation. So you do see larger bubbles at the top, but at higher income levels, you do see fairly large bubbles, even at low levels of CDDs. So it seems that climate's not enough to have high levels of AC penetration. And so also, if you look across at a particular temperature threshold, so if you look at CDs of a certain level, you do generally find that you have some regions where you have large bubbles at very high income levels, even if you have low CDDs, as I said. So if you compare Rio de Janeiro to Sao Paulo, they're not very different in terms of their income levels, but Sao Paulo is relatively cooler and you have a much lower penetration of ACs. So we do want to explore here as well how income and climate interact. And our findings show some interesting factors. So we find that the climate variable that gives you the best goodness of fit actually varies among the countries. And in both Brazil and USA, where you do have very humid components, the wet bulb temperature threshold of 23, and in the US, maximum wet bulb temperature of 23 tends to have the best explanatory power. Whereas in Mexico, which is a little more of a hot and dry country, you still have the average daily temperature, but at a much higher threshold that seems to better explain AC ownership at the household level. If you look at some of the time varying drivers, you see the marginal effect of each of these variables on AC ownership, and you'll see that urbanization has the biggest effect. So whether you're in an urban area or not, the climate has actually a much higher effect than what we saw in the global study, and particularly in Mexico. And in terms of income, there's a similar effect in Brazil and Mexico, but almost none at all in the US, which is not surprising considering most people have an AC. But really, it's the urbanization that has a very distinct effect. And also the new learning is that ownership has an effect. That's quite significant as well. Now, many of these findings are consistent with previous studies that have actually done case studies in different parts of the world. So there are other studies that have found urbanization is important, income is important, and that household ownership is important. It's this interaction between income and climate where we are seeing some differences between different studies, including mine. So overall, it seems that there's a lot of factors we still need to understand better. So before I conclude, I just wanted to spend a minute or two discussing behavior and energy use, as I promised earlier on. From previous work, we found that if you look at the range of energy use that we find in actual surveys of households, the behavioral factors that drive energy use by ACs, given different set point temperatures, given different hours of usage, given how much of your home you cool, how big your home is, we've seen up to a factor of 5 or 10 difference in the amount of energy that's used. And this is far more than the sensitivity that we see from higher efficiency ACs, or even if you think about insulation of buildings to reduce heat losses, which makes us understand that the effect of behavior is really important. And I'm just giving you one example here. In a study in India, we looked at contextual and behavioral factors that influence the amount of energy used per meter square of housing. And we find that the variation is significantly higher than the variation that we see just from looking at more technological aspects in terms of the efficiency of fans and lights and air conditioning on energy use in the homes. So I want to conclude with some key takeaways. Overall, future heat stress is a significant problem that affects billions of people, but it's really quite varied in terms of the estimates that we find. And it depends very significantly on the distribution of income across the world, really, and who's going to buy an air conditioner. We really don't have a deep understanding of the drivers of AC. And what I'm finding in my work is that we really need to look particularly at urbanization, and we need to look at different manifestations of climate, and getting away from this average 20 degrees C is really important. The preliminary results I find indicate that extreme heat seems to be a better explanatory variable than average heat, and urbanization seems to be an even more of a factor than income. Inequality is something that I think is really important that we haven't really focused on yet. We need to dig down deep into understanding how income is distributed so that we know what people in these key countries, China, India, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia, Japan, and the Southern European countries, how income is distributed, how age distribution is going to evolve over time in order to translate exposure to actual heat-related impacts. And that's work that we're continuing in the future. So I'll stop there so we have enough time for questions. Thank you very much once again for this invitation, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rao. That was very interesting. For those of you who joined a bit late, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. To start, I have several questions. I'll just ask the one and then let others go ahead. But towards the end of your talk, you were talking about building integrity and building types. And it's something I'm quite interested in because, as you are well aware and mentioned at the beginning of your talk, increasing use of air conditioners will lead to increasing CO2 emissions. And while those air conditioners are operating using HFCs, they will likely release those HFCs, which are very strong greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. And that will also be a very positive forcing on climate warming. And so the question I have is related to how can people remain cool and comfortable using less air conditioning than might be the natural default based on just the climate and income parameters that you looked at? Because certainly traveling around, one can see that some countries will have a lot of their housing have white roofs. Other places will use tile on the floor and air conditioners and have open construction to increase circulation. Other places might have very good insulation. We see that in Europe, where the buildings are extremely well insulated. So if they close their windows and pull their shades down during the day, they can keep the buildings much more comfortable indoors. And so I'm just wondering, with the idea of trying to become carbon neutral as quickly as possible and reduce the rate of increasing greenhouse gas emissions, what you might think about how we could analyze ways in which people could remain cool and comfortable without resorting to adding air conditioning. Because certainly in some places where the buildings are poorly insulated, they add air conditioners. It takes a huge amount of electricity and they don't actually benefit all that much even from it.
Yeah, so as I mentioned towards the end, right in the last slide, I think that there are, of course, efficiencies to be gained with building shell improvements and also better, more efficient air conditioners. But really, I think it's the behavioral aspects and the contextual aspects. So first of all, the urban form and the fact that you have so many more people disproportionately that are going to be in cities due to migration and growth in areas that are not green and in urban centers. That's one big factor because the demand for air conditioning is increasing disproportionately in urban areas. So I think there are solutions around urban form and built environment and urban greening. I think more than the AC efficiency and the building shell, the behavioral aspect. So we've seen in surveys set point temperatures across the world ranging from 21 Celsius to 28 Celsius. So in Malaysia, we found people using 28 But in India, people use 21 to 22 degrees Celsius, and this has a very, very significant impact, of course. Think about central air conditioning versus wall units in bedrooms. Think about whether you cool the room only at night to sleep, and during the day when you're not around, you don't cool very much. Think about the size of people's homes. We found that the square meters completely dwarfs the energy use per square meter in terms of the overall AC use, if you look both across the US or across India. So these are some of the factors that I think are much more important drivers than technology. Even the idea of passive cooling solutions depend a lot on urban form and ventilating homes, and passive solutions. In regions that are hot and dry, there is a technological solution. So air coolers that don't require ACs, you can just have a fan with water blowing through it that can give you a temperature reduction of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius quite easily. That would be a good solution for hot and dry climates. But in humid climates, you do need to think about dehumidification as well as ACs potentially, because that may also give you some temperature reduction, but most of the relief is reduced humidity. So dehumidifiers could be much less energy intensive than ACs. So there's really a host of solutions, technological, behavioral, and structural, but I think really it's the behavioral ones that are the most dominant in terms of expected energy use in the future.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how behavior might be changed to benefit people's comfort levels and the climate.
Yeah, and that's when we get into sociology, the sociology of energy use, which is another more interdisciplinary endeavor that needs to be undertaken more and more in the future.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a couple of questions here. One from an anonymous attendee. So I guess I'll read this question. It says, Dr. Rao, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if the ownership of air conditioners also affects perception of climate change. Do we find that AC ownership, particularly among the rich, reduces climate action amongst them, but perhaps increases it amongst lower and middle income communities?
I'm not sure if the ownership of ACs necessarily affects environmental values or behavior in other respects with regards to mitigation. I do think that the adoption of ACs itself is maybe a reflection of people's concern for mitigation. So it may be a marker perhaps. But largely I would think that those are not necessarily related. I think there are a lot of, like I said, sociological factors that are driving the adoption of ACs in the first place that we don't understand. It's not necessarily reflective of individual preferences. So, for instance, we see the bundling of ACs in real estate in homes that are sold, and that's something that doesn't necessarily reflect people's preferences, but still influences their behavior. And you have an AC when you buy a home, you use it. So I don't think I see that kind of coupling, but it may be an indicator of people's concern in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Professor Rob Soklow has a question saying, he says, say more about air conditioner use. Can you use kilowatt hour data?
Yeah, so we have done, we do a lot of work on estimation of energy. We have a building stock model for the world, and we look at different types of buildings and energy usage and look at the sensitivity to different parameters. And we expect that the most minimal energy use to avoid heat stress, which is cooling your homes to 26 degrees Celsius, not lower than that, cooling only bedrooms up to 10 square meters per capita, and cooling only at night, so 8 hours a day. So that level of minimum cooling actually would require, for the number of people we say are exposed to heat stress, less than a gigajoule per capita per year, per square meter, and less than 1,000 terawatt hours globally. And that compares to estimates that you may have seen of anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 terawatt hours of energy use from ACs. And so that's what I mean, partly from the behavioral aspect and structural aspects, because our assumptions use conventional AC technology, but just by using reasonable amounts of insulation, but really minimizing the use and to high set points, you achieve a factor of 5 or more reduction in energy use.
Actually, Rob, would you like to ask anything further regarding this question?
Yes, it's a fascinating subject. I worked on it a long time ago. Behavior is so important. I'm glad you've gotten there. But there's the economist would say, what about the cost of the air conditioner? What about the cost of electricity?
Mhm.
For those variables as well, this is going to be peak power. It's going to create its own effects. And then there's the commercial as well as the residential. They're roughly equal, I think, in some places. When you have a store or a school, this is the sleeper, I think, in really trying to keep. It's tremendously important. I'm glad you're working on it. I'm trying to keep the energy demand within some sort of boundary. And you didn't mention Africa, so that's one more point. Why is that not on the horizon here? So those are questions: the cost of power, and Africa, and in general, overall, congratulations.
Thanks for those questions, Rob. Yeah, the cost of power, ironically, today is staving off a lot of AC ownership. AC is a luxury item in the developing world. India has 10% penetration of ACs in households. Has 20 million out of 200 million households. So that's a factor that's actually right now going to change in the direction of with market growth, making them more affordable. And so that's going to strengthen the problem. That's the same reason why we don't see a lot of ACs in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. It's just purely affordability. So we do have them in the model. They're just the lines. You don't see the lines because they're so low. You do have some income growth, but the commercial aspect, you're absolutely right, is really a sleeper. Most models are not even considering it. They're just considering income growth. And I think when you consider affordability of ACs, we actually need to make them more affordable to a lot of people to avoid heat stress. But the question is, can we make alternative cooling solutions more affordable so that people don't have to go to an AC? And there, I think, like I said, dehumidifiers in humid regions, air coolers in hotter regions, we need to try and focus more on promoting those solutions. And we also need to understand that there's a lot of sociological factors like social norms that influence AC uptake in the middle classes. And this is where we have to focus mitigation efforts. And this is where I was mentioning that, yeah, we need to influence behavior. So it's kind of this two-pronged policy approach where we need to, on the one hand, make cooling affordable and make cooling expensive at the same time. And that's the big challenge, I think, from a policy perspective.
And actually, just following up on that, what about the Kigali Amendment? How quickly are developing countries going to stop using these extremely strong greenhouse gases in their air conditioner compressors? Because if the uptake is rapid and they're all using HFCs, the positive feedback on climate will be substantial, as you well know.
Yes, and in fact, I don't remember all the details off the top of my head, but countries such as India have a very long grandfathering period for the existing refrigerants. So yes, in the next 10 to 15 years, those ACs are going to go into use, and about a quarter of them potentially could be leaking refrigerant into the atmosphere. So there is that, and I don't see how that's going to change because they do have that grandfathering. I do believe, though, that the bulk of the climate impact is going to come from the energy use more than from the leaked refrigerant. I guess you can have control over the refrigerant leak more than you can over the energy use. I think there's, but by and large, it is an issue. And the grandfathering is also an issue, but I think the energy use really should be the main focus of policy attention. And alternative solutions and phasing out of old refrigerants through regulation is what we know to be the approach we need.
And perhaps good maintenance of the equipment might help in some efforts to recycle the refrigerant from older air conditioners that are decommissioned. I think we have time only for one more question. There's one last question from, again, an anonymous attendee. When dealing with survey data with different countries, are they conducted by the same organization? Is the accuracy level the same for the three countries?
No, these are, each country has their own statistical offices. There's the Census Department in the US. There's other departments in different countries that do these surveys, but we've been relying on surveys that are periodic surveys. So these have been honed over years and years. The sampling has been honed, so they're pretty reliable surveys in all these cases, but they're all different groups. So yes, there certainly may be differences in the way they ask the questions. But by and large, when it comes to the question I asked, which is just AC possession, the only uncertainty is renters versus owners. So my suspicion is that people answer whether they have access to an AC, not whether they actually own it. So a renter would say yes to the AC possession. So I'm pretty sure that all our surveys include owners and renters. But other than that, I don't see a major difference across surveys.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating work with us. We really appreciate you taking the time to Zoom in. We hope to see you in person sometime in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.